everyone, and welcome to this session of the World Economic Forum. My name is Mehreen Khan. I'm the economics editor at The Times in London, and it's my pleasure to host everyone here in the room and watching on live stream. Today's session has got quite a grandiose title. It's called Growth, a History and a Reckoning, and it's my pleasure to be introducing Daniel Susskind, who's written a book with that title. Daniel is a research economist at King's College London and also at Oxford University. His book on growth, which was published in April last year, has many endorsements. Perhaps the best I can give it is that it was named by President Obama as one of his books of 2024, and that was quite a short list. And as we all know, President Obama has pretty discerning taste, so that's probably one of the best endorsements that you could get. Daniel is going to be presenting the thesis of his book. It's a sort of tour de force of the concept of growth, what we get wrong about the notion of growth, and I think more pertinently for lots of people who were at Davos this week, how to get out of the growth trap that lots of developed world economies seem to find themselves in, which is not just an economic trap, but also is probably the most pressing political question facing so many of our societies today. So Daniel is going to present the thesis of his work. I would encourage everyone in the room to try and come up with the most difficult questions possible, because we're going to throw it back to you and then have a little discussion. But my first task is to welcome Daniel on stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Three facts, simple but remarkable, have defined the economic history of human beings until now. The first is that for most of the 300,000 years that human beings have been around, economic life was essentially stagnant. The second is that it was only very recently that this stagnation came to an end. Modern economic growth began just 200 years ago. And the third is that somehow we have managed to maintain this economic ascent. Now, as time has passed, we've used this growing material prosperity to achieve remarkable outcomes, freeing billions from the struggle for subsistence that haunted our ancestors, making the average human life far longer and healthier than ever before, funding discoveries that have transformed our understanding of the world, splitting the atom, cracking the genetic code, starting to explore the stars. But it's also clear that this pursuit of prosperity has come at an enormous price. The destruction of the natural environment, the desolation of local cultures and communities, the emergence of vast inequalities between those who have the greatest share in this wealth and those who do not, the creation, the pursuit of technologies like artificial intelligence whose disruptive effects on work and politics it's not clear we can properly control. And so we face a dilemma. On the one hand, growth is associated with many of our greatest triumphs and achievements, but on the other hand, it's also associated with many of our greatest challenges that we face today as well. And so what I want to do today is explore how we can resolve this growth dilemma. And in particular, I want to do four things. The first is I want to talk a little bit about the history of economic growth, the pursuit of economic growth, a very recent phenomenon. The second is I want to set out how I think we can get more growth. And the starting point for me really is that we need to pursue more growth. But I also want to explain how we can pursue a different type of growth as well. And finally, and fourthly, I want to raise the question, what do we do, though, if we can't change the nature of growth? And how do we confront and engage the difficult moral questions that it poses? So let's dive in. First, the history. What's interesting about growth is that although today it sits right at the center of our common political life together, before the 1950s, almost no politicians, policymakers, economists, anyone was talking about the idea of economic growth. What's more, even if people had decided they wanted to pursue economic growth, they wouldn't have been able to. Back then, there was no reliable measure of how large the economy was, whether it was growing, and if so, by how much. That only changes in the 1940s with the Second World War. A basic question when you're waging war is how much of the economy can we slice up and dedicate to the war effort? And yet, to the great frustration of policymakers and politicians, particularly in the UK at the time, they didn't have an answer. And so in stepped the great British economist John Maynard Keynes, alongside his American contemporary Simon Kuznets, to develop what would become the first measure, the first reliable measure of how large the economy was, what's known as gross domestic product, or GDP. But this statistical innovation is only a small part of the story. GDP is a sort of static snapshot of how large the economy is at any particular moment in time. But growth is about the relentless pursuit of ever-increasing GDP. So how did growth become such a priority? Well, the answer to that question is, again, war, albeit war of a different type. So when the Cold War begins, it's a very different type of conflict, and none of the traditional measures to tell who's winning are available, things like territory won and lost, soldiers killed, weapons destroyed, and so on. And what becomes a kind of proxy measure for who's winning the Cold War is which economy, the US or the Soviet Union, is growing faster. John F. Kennedy in the 1960s spoke about how growth would help those who sit on the razor edge of decision between them and us to fall on the side of capitalism. Nikita Khrushchev at the same time spoke about how growth would be the battering ram with which they would smash the capitalist system. So it's war, first hot, then cold, that makes growth such a central priority. But as the 20th century unfolds and the demands of war fall away, it turns out that growth is associated with almost every measure of human flourishing. Economies that grow more have higher living standards, people live longer and healthier lives, they've got better education systems, and so on. And so as the demands of war fall away, growth sort of stubbornly remains behind as a policy priority. So how do we get more of it? And this really is my starting point, because if growth were to fizzle out, it would be a catastrophe for all the sorts of reasons that I've suggested. And again, what's interesting about the idea of growth is that although politicians and policymakers talk very confidently today about the causes of growth, we know surprisingly little about them. It really is one of the great mysteries of economic thought. Having said that, I do think there is one lesson that we can draw from the sort of fog of uncertainty about the causes of economic growth, and it's this, which is that more growth comes from more technological progress, and more technological progress comes from the discovery of more ideas about the world, more creative, innovative, inventive, ingenious ideas about the world. Now, this observation that growth comes from the discovery of more ideas is important, I think, for two reasons. The first reason it's important is that it really helps us dispel some sort of popular misunderstandings about the causes of growth or the challenges of growth. So, it's very common today to hear this sort of phrase: infinite growth is not possible on a finite planet. It's the slogan of the so-called degrowth movement. It's very popular in the environmental movement, but it's a mistake. Infinite growth is, in fact, possible on a finite planet. And the reason why I think it's a mistake is that those who hold this view are often drawing on a very old-fashioned, a very traditional conception of where growth comes from. The idea that growth comes from using ever more finite resources, more land, more raw materials, and so on. But this isn't where growth comes from. Growth, in fact, comes from making ever more productive use of the finite resources that we have. Put another way, growth comes from technological progress. So a different way to see this is that growth doesn't come, as many people have traditionally assumed, from the world of tangible objects, the things we can see and touch and drop on our feet, but growth comes from the intangible world of ideas. So what do I mean by ideas? I mean essentially recipes or instructions for organizing the atoms in the world. Essentially recipes or instructions for making more productive use of the finite resources that we have. And the key point here is that whereas those resources might be finite, the world of ideas is unimaginably vast, for all intents and purposes, as good as infinite. So just to really hammer that point home, think of a kitchen larder back home, and imagine it's a well-stocked larder with 300 or so ingredients. So there are finite ingredients in this larder, but there are more possible recipes for combining those ingredients than there are on planet Earth. And this, I think, is exactly the same intuition we should have, not when we're thinking about 300 ingredients in a kitchen, but quite literally all the resources that we have on planet Earth. Now, the second reason I think this observation that growth comes from the discovery of more ideas about the world is particularly important is because it gives us a sense of where growth comes from, how we might generate more growth. And in particular, I think there are four main levers that we have for generating more growth. The first is reforming our antiquated intellectual property regimes. The second is investing vastly more in research and development, the discovery of new ideas. Third, getting vastly more people into the parts of the economy that are responsible for developing ideas. And finally, and I think most radically, using these technologies themselves to help us generate more ideas. So let me just say a little more on a couple of these. First, the idea of research and development. Just to give you a sense of what countries are currently investing in R&D at the moment, here's a range of different countries. R&D expenditure as a percentage of GDP. Out in front is Israel, investing over 5% of their GDP in research and development, followed closely by Taiwan and Korea. The US manages just over 3% of GDP. My hometown, Britain, manages barely half of that. I think a lesson for many of the countries in the sort of long tail here is that they need to invest vastly more in research and development. But what's really interesting and I think really striking and should make us all sit up a bit straighter is when you compare what the leading countries do to what leading technology companies do. So Israel invests 5.4% of its GDP a year in research and development, but the leading technology companies are all investing 3 to 4 times that as a percentage of their revenue. Now, of course, companies aren't countries, but this just gives you a flavor of what it would look like to take really seriously the idea that growth comes from new ideas, it comes from research and development. Let me just also say something about the final, and as I said, the most radical lever that we have, the idea of using technology itself to help us generate ideas. I think we sort of caught a glimpse of this during the pandemic when Moderna used artificial intelligence to generate one of the earliest vaccines for COVID-19. One of, I think, the most interesting examples of this, though, was more recently, in the last few months, in fact, when it was the award of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, which nominally went to a team of human researchers, but in practice actually went to an AI system, AlphaFold 2, which solved the long-standing, seemingly intractable protein folding problem in biology. This is what I think we're going to see more and more of in the 21st century. In the 20th century, the best ideas we had, the most creative, innovative, ingenious ideas, came from the heads of smart human beings. In the 21st century, they're going to increasingly come from our technologies instead. But we cannot simply, and this is really important given the growth dilemma before, we cannot simply plow on and pursue more growth alone. That would be to commit the same mistakes as the past. And so what we've also got to do is use every tool at our disposal to try and change the nature of the economic growth that we pursue as well. And I think really the best example of what this looks like in practice is what's happened with one particular dimension of the price of growth, which is its impact on the environment, its impact on the climate. Now, what's interesting is that if you go back to 2007 and have a look at the Stern Review into the economics of climate change, written by Lord Nicholas Stern, one of the first reports of its kind into the economics of climate change, one of the really striking conclusions of this report was that if we wanted to reduce emissions by 80%, we would have to pay a price of 1% of GDP per year. There was a really striking trade-off between growth and the climate. The next year, Nicholas Stern stepped forward and said, no, I got it wrong. Climate change is worse than I fear. We're actually going to have to pay 2% of GDP per year if we want to reduce emissions by 80%. The price had got higher. Fast forward, though, to the year 2020 and have a look at the report done by the UK Climate Change Committee into so the team of experts tasked with advising the British government on climate change. One of the central conclusions of that report was that if we wanted to eliminate emissions, so not simply reduce them by 80%, but eliminate them, it would cost us just 0.5% of GDP per year. In other words, that trade-off between growth and the climate had dramatically improved. We'd have to pay a far lower price in terms of growth to protect the environment. And the big question is why? What happened? Why did this improve? And the answer, in short, is that several decades of changes in taxes and subsidies, rules and regulations, social norms and customs just completely transformed the incentives that people faced in society. So they were incentivized not simply to develop new technologies, which, as I said, is the stuff that drives economic growth, but to develop particular types of technologies, namely technologies that were green, that were clean rather than dirty. And so what we had was not simply a technological revolution, but a green technological revolution. And I think really the greatest example of this is what happened with solar energy over the last half decade or so. It begins in 1976 as a sort of tool of last resort if you want to generate electricity in outer space or in isolated lighthouses. But as time unfolds, what we saw was an exponential decrease in the cost of generating electricity via solar. So from about $100 per watt in 1976 to about $0.50 per watt today. And as a result, an exponential increase in its uptake as well. We see them everywhere now. And what these sorts of innovations in practice have allowed us to do, or have allowed countries to do, more and more countries to do, is to grow while at the same time reducing their emissions, to dramatically weaken the trade-off between the pursuit of more prosperity and those other things, in this case, the environment, that we might think is valuable and important. And so the lesson, it seems to me, is we shouldn't underestimate the power of incentives to change the sorts of technologies that we develop in society. We can change those sorts of technologies if we want to, and we should be trying to do it not simply with respect to the impact that new technologies and economic growth have on the climate, but also with respect to those other dimensions of the price as well. That growth is associated with growing inequalities, that growth is associated, in many cases, with undermining the availability of good work, undermining how well our politics function, and disrupting local places and communities. Now, I think the best way to summarize all of this is in terms of two contrasting metaphors. And I think the metaphor that many policymakers and politicians and business leaders have in mind when they talk about the idea of economic growth and they talk about the idea of technological progress is that it's almost as if they're sort of train drivers in a train. And they can push the throttle and go faster or pull it back and go slower. You know, they can have more or less growth, more or less technological progress. But their direction of travel is fixed by the sort of rails that are set down in front of them to trundle along. And I think this is a mistake. I think a far better metaphor to have in mind is a nautical one. You know, we can raise our sails and go faster, or we can pull them down and go slower, but we've also got huge discretion over our direction of travel. Or put another way, the choice that we face as a society isn't simply do we want more or less technological progress and more or less growth, but it's also what sort of growth do we want? What sort of technologies do we want to encourage people to develop and adopt in society? Now, I think the big challenge, and this is what I want to close on, is, well, what do we do if we can't change the nature of growth? What do we do when we face a choice between the pursuit of more material prosperity or protecting those other ends that we care about? And I think this is one of the hardest questions that we can ask one another in society. Now, the traditional response from many policymakers and politicians and economists is to say, well, look, this is an issue of measurement. And what we ought to do is we ought to try and identify those things out there that we think are valuable and important, the state of the environment, the level of inequality in society. And we ought to try and measure those things and bundle them in to the GDP measure, building a sort of more perfect GDP measure, a sort of GDP plus. And I think this is a big mistake. And I think it's a mistake because these questions, again, about what we ought to value if not growth, and how much we ought to value them, those are not technical questions about mismeasurement. Those are moral questions about what matters. And the place for asking those sorts of moral questions is not among economists and statisticians and government officials, but it's politics. It's among citizens. And so what I think is really important is that we try and encourage and try and support a wave of political innovation that will create spaces in which people, citizens, are able to come together time and time again to debate these really important questions. And I take a lot of courage from the rise of so-called mini-publics that we see around the world in the last few years. Things like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, citizens' panels. These are exactly the sorts of political innovations that we need to see more of to engage with these thorny, difficult moral questions about what we ought to care about as a society. So let me just finish and close on a note of optimism. You know, we live at a time when every day it feels like we are reminded of the existential challenges that we face and our supposed incapacity for dealing with them. But what I have tried to do today, and what I try and do in my work, is argue that no, we also have an existential opportunity in front of us as well. We have a chance now for moral renewal, a chance to pay more attention to the other important things that the other important ends that we might have neglected until now. And we can do so from a position of strength, looking forward to the future, you know, far more technologically capable and materially prosperous than ever before. We have the power, in the words of the great late philosopher Derek Parfit, we have the power not just to make life good in decades to come, but to make it better in ways that we now cannot even imagine. Really nothing, in my view, could be more important, and that is what this session and my work in general is all about. So thank you very much indeed, and I look forward to hearing some reflections and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I'm glad you ended on a note of optimism, because I'm a journalist, which means I have to bring it back down to maybe some of the gloomier stuff. I'm going to abuse my privilege as the moderator to ask one question, and then we'll throw it open, because we don't have so much time. We're living at a pretty unique moment. It feels like we're at some kind of juncture, which is another journalistic cliche, but I'm really feeling it this week. And it's this kind of juncture which is not just about the amount of growth we've had, and maybe not even the type, but about the distribution.
Yes.
And the idea that the system that we've created, which has made many people prosperous, it's lifted more people out of poverty in the last 30 years than we've ever done in human history. But actually the distribution meant that too many people were made losers out of the system. Yeah. And I think if we want to define the era that we're in of economic nationalism or economic populism, it's basically the idea that the losers want to take some revenge. Yeah. And that often invokes this idea of winning again at the expense of others, and also creating a system of prosperity, which means that often prosperity is related to jobs. Yeah. And so the looking forward part of your book is very much about R&D, technological progress, AI, which is already happening, but it doesn't seem to be an obvious way to compensate those losers. Yeah. So I guess my question is, you know, how do you satisfy that almost primal scream of people who are fed up with the system and who want something new, with what you've laid out, which is a techno-optimistic future, and can that future actually alleviate some of the societal schisms that
let me make two observations. One is I completely agree, and that is why one of the prices of growth that's up there that I think is really important, and sometimes people push back on, is the idea that growth is inequality creating, because I think it's really important. You know, one of the reasons that growth really appealed in that post-Cold War moment, particularly in the United States, was a feeling that growth kind of, and it was a mistaken feeling, but a feeling that growth solved those worries about distribution. There was a feeling that everyone was benefiting, and traditional worries of how to slice up the pie were kind of less in a world where the pie was getting bigger and everyone seemed to benefit. You know, again, that line by John F. Kennedy, a rising tide lifts all boats. It turned out that that's not the case. And so I think this sort of inequality dimension is really important. Let me just kind of, the second thing I want to say, though, is that I think there are many really compelling reasons why why inequality is sort of morally undesirable, morally abhorrent. But the thing that I write about in this book and write about in my work is also, just to put it bluntly, how extraordinarily inefficient inequality is. The idea that there are so many people out there with extraordinary talents and abilities, and they're never able to put them to use. I mean, there's fascinating work done on this idea of lost Einsteins. The number of people out there with extraordinary inventive capability who, because of the inequalities that they faced in their lives, they're unable to put them to productive use. So I think that the arguments for reducing inequality aren't just the sort of traditional compelling moral ones, but there's also just bluntly economic reasons for doing it, which is that it's just extraordinarily inefficient to have so many talented people not able to put their talents to use.
And when you're touring the book, I imagine some finance ministries or economic authorities want to hear about what you're saying. Do you feel that that's receptive? It's falling on receptive ears, the need to diminish that inequality in whatever comes next?
I think many people are familiar with those moral reasons, but I think the economic case for reducing inequality is less familiar. And that's one of the things that I think is important that I focus on. There's a really striking statistic from the United States, which is that if children from families of low socioeconomic backgrounds and ethnic minorities invented as the same rate as sort of prosperous white men, there would be a quadrupling of innovation in America. Again, that is on the one hand sort of morally inappropriate, but it's also just staggeringly economically inefficient.
We'll throw it open. I think we'll group the questions together. So we got gentleman over here, the lady over here, and we'll take the two gentlemen. I take four. So I'll write them down. So we'll start at the front. And please let us know who you are. Oh.
Hello, I'm Roberta. I'm and social innovator from Brazil. Traditional economics metrics like GPD focus on growth without capturing sustainability, equality, or society or nature well-being. What alternative, Daniel, frameworks do you see as most promising for measuring economic success in a way that integrates all these concerns? And there is any example of anyone doing this right that you can share with us?
Thank you. We'll go to Gilles, and then I'll put them all to you at the end.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your very short presentation. As you well know, and you said this actually, there is no automaticity between idea generation and growth. We had phases when idea generation accelerated, say the Renaissance, for instance, and there was no acceleration in growth. So it takes a very specific cultural atmosphere to turn idea generation into growth. And my question to you is, if I think about the current cultural atmosphere, it seems to me it's divided between those who believe in growth, but are not necessarily super interested in the moral aspects you mentioned about the dangers of growth coming, for instance, from climate change. And you can have ideas about who I have in mind here. And those on the other side who care a lot about the consequences of growth, but who are tempted by what you say is the wrong approach, which is degrowth.
Yes.
So how do we actually, make sure that this path, with which I agree, is actually a path which becomes popular?
Yes.
Thank you. We have, sorry. We've got the two gentlemen there. If we've got time at the end, we'll take one very quickly.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. My question actually echoes the first one that was asked, but my understanding was that the people that invented GDP as a metric considered not including products like advertising as a part of GDP originally. And I'm wondering, in your view, are there parts of the economy, to the first woman's point, that perhaps, like for example, if we found natural gas in Cameroon, and Cameroon's GDP was growing, but its climate impact was also growing in a way that I would consider to be negative, how we could take that into account in our metrics?
Yeah, it's finally, Monsieur.
Oh, thank you. Really fascinating and stimulating. I have one technical question and a more general one. The technical question is about the cost of avoiding climate change, your 0.5%. If I compare it with the Draghi report, for instance, he says about 3% of GDP in yearly investments. So is it a bit too optimistic? And the more general question is about the link with demography, because we have lived through 2 centuries of exponential demographic growth. And the next centuries could be different, with a stabilization and then a decrease. Would the growth story would be definitely different also?
Yes. Really interesting.
Okay, I'm glad everyone took my my advice at the beginning to ask very hard questions very seriously. So we've got a question about better measurement and who does it better. Let's start with that one. Or is anyone doing it well?
Yeah, so one of the big lessons from the history of the idea of economic growth is, I think, that what you choose to count becomes what counts. And that is what happened with GDP in the second half of the 20th century. We chose to count GDP because it was primarily quite a useful tool in conflict. And yet over time, it sort of had kind of accumulated this sort of moral aura that became central to our political life. So I think what you count matters. Having said that, I don't think the direction of travel, and this is what I was saying today, I don't think the direction of travel, which is to try and identify these things that we value and bundle them into a single number, a single statistic, a sort of GDP plus, is the right way to do it. I think a far better approach is a sort of dashboard approach, where you just recognize that GDP, and it comes to your comment as well, the GDP is a sort of very limited, flawed measure in lots of different directions. But it's meant to, let's just treat it as a sort of narrow measure of the value of the economic activity that takes place in a market, and also have alongside it measures of other things that we think are valuable and important. But the big caveat is the question of what those things are and how we ought to value them alongside one another. Those are not statistical questions. Those are moral questions about what matters. And it's why I think we need to get more of politics involved in deciding what goes in these dashboards and how we weigh those things up against each other. Again, these are moral questions, not questions of mismeasurement.
And then we've got the question about perhaps people on the right side of history wanting less growth, and the ones who want a lot of growth maybe not being the most moral among us.
So there was also something in your question which I completely agree with, which is the importance of culture. One of the big questions about the history of economic growth is not simply why does it begin when it does in the sort of 1780s, but why does it begin where it does? Why does it begin in Britain, this sort of cold, rainy archipelago? Why? And for me, one of the most compelling reasons is cultural. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Industrial Revolution happens in the sort of tailwind of, exactly as you say, the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. There's a sense in which the sort of philosophy, the mindset, the culture that was developed in those sort of academic intellectual settings sort of seeped out into the commercial setting. And people adopted a sort of scientific mentality, a scientific culture, a scientific attitude in thinking about commercial problems as they had with respect to intellectual problems. So I think culture is absolutely critical. The challenge, of course, is that culture is, as you say, quite a sort of fuzzy and difficult thing to manage and shape and influence. But I think you can do it indirectly through those sorts of levers that I was describing, by investing vastly more in research and development, by reforming intellectual property, by trying to develop the kind of economy that supports people who develop new ideas about the world, by using these technologies themselves to help us generate new ideas.
And we've massively over time, but very quickly on demographics.
So the demographic question is very interesting, and there's a lot we could say about it, but my view, and it really comes to that final observation I made about how in the 20th century, the best ideas we had about the world came from the heads of smart human beings. It's why economists called it the human capital century. The idea that having more and more educated people coming up with more and more ideas is the way to generate productivity and growth. I think that's going to change in the 21st century. And I think our best ideas about the world are going to come more and more from the technologies that we develop instead. And so perhaps I'm slightly less concerned by the sort of traditional worries about demography in the 21st century, because I don't think if you're looking for the kind of causes of prosperity in the 21st century, it's going to come from the same origins as it did in the 20th century, namely lots of smart people.
Older people.
Older people. Sorry?
This will be older people.
In the 21st, I suppose the point I'm making is that in the 21st century, I think the story is going to be far more about the technologies we develop than about the people that we educate and train.
My last task is to say thank you very much, Daniel, for this excellent presentation, and please go and buy his book. Thank you.